Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and in Miyutz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Pei Aleph Amud Beis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lines from the top in the Shulchan Aruch with the words of the Ramah Hagah. And that is Siman Shin Aleph in the middle of Sif Chaf Hey. Our learning should be uschus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanasunim Batzara Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziem Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelo L'Oiro Mishiba L'Geula Hashta Bagala Uvizban Kariv and Amar Amen. Our learning should be uschus Refuah Shalema for Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradl Tzvi ben Leah Miriam Chava Dasa Bas Rezel Serel Dvar Bas Shoshabina Rivka Bas Shira Leah. They should have a Refuah Shalema B'Seich Shar Chole Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol makom shehem. Just a quick comment on Inyana D'Yoma, a.k.a. current events. There's a lot of excitement going on over the inauguration of a new president here in the United States, the inauguration of President Trump. I just want to put in my words of caution that I always put in, which is, remember that our betachin is only in the Rebbeinu Shalom. We don't place our betachin in anything else or anyone else. When you put your betachin in anyone else or anything else, that is not a recipe for success. Indeed, it is a recipe for disaster. Furthermore, I would also note that the pasuk tells us, "Leiv malachim v'sarim biyad Hashem." The hearts of kings and ministers lie in the hands of Hashem. What my Rebbe, Reuven Feinstein, Zalzayin Gesund Stark, always told me is, what that means is, somebody could run for president and he could say whatever he wants as long as he's campaigning, because he's not a melech and he's not a sar, so he has his own mind. And that's why campaign promises are so often broken, not only because of dishonesty, but also because when they're running, they have their own mind. But leiv melachim v'sarim biyad Hashem, once they become a melech, once they become a sar, then they don't have their own mind anymore. Leiv melachim v'sarim biyad Hashem. That's also in Yonah D'Yoma. Learn Parshas Shemais, learn Parshas Va'era, see what happened to Paroi. Hashem hichzik is slave Paroi. So it's leiv melachim v'sarim biyad Hashem. That's where we put our faith. We don't put it anywhere else. Okay, now my commentary is finished. Let's go back to our regularly scheduled broadcasting. So here in Shin Aleph Sif Chaf Hey, we're discussing this concept of a kameya. The kameya was an amulet, and these amulets sometimes contained bundles of herbs or grasses, or sometimes these amulets contained an igeres or a ksav. They had a paper with a text, otherwise known here in the Mechaber as a lachash. Lachash means an incantation, but this is not something that you said. We're going to deal with that as well. Here we're dealing with something that's written. So somebody who had this chachma, the chachma of how to create an effective kameya, would write a lachash. He would write a text on a piece of paper, put it into an amulet, and then an ill individual would wear this amulet. Now, this to us sounds a little bit like heebie-jeebie stuff, but the bottom line is that this was a chachma, and this was a chachma that worked. If you knew how to write an amulet, you knew how to write a kameya for a particular illness, it could be effective. And therefore, the halacha is, we need to discuss, comes up for discussion, are you allowed to go out wearing a kameya on Shabbos? And what the Mechaber has told us is, it depends. If it's a kameya mumcha, if it's a kameya that's proven to be an effective kameya, then an ill individual is allowed to go out with it on Shabbos. Why? Because this is an effective form of refuah. So it is something that provides the person with a function. This now becomes a functional tachshit. This is a tachshit for this ill individual, it's not considered a masui. And it's not a burden, it's a takshit. And therefore he is allowed to go out with it on Shabbos. But, like we've said, it has to be a kameya that's mumcha. It has to be a kameya that's proven to be effective. If it's a kameya she'enoi mumcha, if it's an unproven kameya, then you're not allowed to go out with it on Shabbos. Why? Because so long as it's an unproven kameya, it's not considered a takshit. It doesn't rise to the level of takshit. It remains a masui, and therefore to go out with it on Shabbos would be akin to carrying it on Shabbos, which was usher. Now here so far in Sif Chafei, we have learned that there are two different tracks, if you will, for a kameya to become known as a kameya mumcha. One is that the kameya itself could become a kameya mumcha. The other one is that the writer of the kameya is a mumcha. He's a professional. He's known, he has a chazaka to be able to write this kameya, and this is an effective kameya. What are the two different tracks? So in order for the writer of the kameya to be considered a mumcha, he has to have written this same kameya. So that means he fashioned one of these amulets. He wrote the text, he put it in the amulet, he gave it to an ill individual, and the ill individual wore it, and it cured him. Then he wrote the same lachash, and he made another kameya, and he gave it to another person who was afflicted with the same illness, and he cured that person. Then he fashioned a third kameya, using the same lachash, gave it to another person who's suffering from the same ailment, and he cured that person. In that case, the writer of these amulets has now cured 3 different people who are all suffering from the same ailment, and he cured them with 3 different kameyas. He fashioned 3 kameyas, all containing the same lachash. They all contain the same text. But he fashioned 3 of these kameyas, and he used them to cure 3 different people. At this point, he is now considered a mumcha kameya writer. Now, if a 4th person comes along suffering from the same ailment, he could now go and fashion a 4th kameya using the same lachash, the same text, give it to the 4th person, and the 4th person will be allowed to wear it outside in Rishus HaRabim on Shabbos, because the kameya that he has was written by a kameya mumcha. Now, if this mumcha kameya writer for the 4th person decides that he's going to go off the reservation and he's going to write a different lachash, then the 4th person cannot go out with it to Rishus HaRabim. He's not a mumcha kameya writer, so that now, no matter what lachash he writes, it's considered a kameya mumcha, and the wearer could go out with it on Shabbos. No, he's only a mumcha for using that particular lachash for that ailment. So whatever the lachash is, whatever lachash he used to cure 3 different people from this ailment, he can now write that same lachash, and he can make new kameyas, he could fashion new ones, and give them to additional people, and they could all go out with those kameyas on Shabbos, because he's a mumcha for writing that kameya to heal that affliction. So that's the track of the kameya writer being a mumcha. Then there's the track of the kameya itself being a kameya mumcha. How does that work? Very simple. Let's say the kameya writer writes a lachash on a kameya, and he gives it to somebody, and it cures that person. Then that person goes ahead and takes it and gives it to another person who has the same affliction, and it cures the second person. Then the second person takes it and gives it to a third person, and that kameya cures a third person from that affliction. Now, in this case, the kameya writer only wrote 1 kameya. He didn't write 3 different kameyas. He only wrote 1. That 1 went ahead and cured 3 people. Oh, so now the kameya writer doesn't become a mumcha, because he cured 3 people, but all with the same kameya. He didn't cure 3 people with 3 kameyas. So he's not a mumcha kameya writer, but the kameya is a kameya mumcha because that kameya cured 3 people. Not only that, it doesn't even really have to cure 3 people. It could cure the same person 3 times. So if the kameya writer wrote this kameya for Ruvain, and he gave it to Ruvain in 2022 when he had the flu, and Ruvain used it in 2022 and it cured him of the flu, and then he got the flu in 2023 and he pulled the kameya out of his drawer and he used it again. Then he got the flu again in 2024 and he pulled it out of his drawer and he used it and it cured him again. So this kameya is now a kameya mumcha because it cured 3 times. It doesn't have to cure 3 different people, but it has to cure 3 times. So in that case, the kameya is a kameya mumcha. So here we have those 2 tracks. We have either the kameya writer becomes a mumcha. How does that work? He cured 3 different people using 3 kameyas, all with the same lachash. Or the kameya becomes a mumcha because that one kameya cured 3 times. Then the Mechaber went ahead, and this part I'm going to read inside. Then the Mechaber went ahead and said, so we have these 2 tracks, but it's also possible that you can have both. You can have a kameya that's written by a writer who's a mumcha, and the kameya itself is also a mumcha. Let's read those words inside. If you go 3 lines down near the end of the line, the Mechaber said, V'cholshke, certainly if you have both milas, iyasmaki gavra v'kameya, if the person, the writer of the kameya is a mumcha, v'kameya, and the kameya is also a kameya mumcha. How do you have that? And here's where we have to pay attention, because here's where the Ramah is going to come along and qualify what the Mechaber says. Says the Mechaber, what's the case over here? Kegoy. Shekosav lachash echad b'shalosh igaros. The writer goes ahead and he uses the same text, right? The same lachash, and he fashions 3 amulets, 3 kameyas. V'chol achas ha'ila l'shloisha anoshim. So he goes ahead and he writes kameya number 1 using a lachash. He gives it to Ruvain, it cures Ruvain. He gives it to Shimon, it cures Shimon. He gives it to Levi, it cures Levi. What do we have now? Do we have a mumcha kameya writer? No, because he cured 3 people, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. But it was all done with the same kameya. He only wrote 1 kameya. So he's not yet a mumcha. How about the kameya? Is the kameya a mumcha? Yeah. That 1 kameya cured Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. So far we have a kameya that's a mumcha, but we don't have a mumcha kameya writer. But then what happened? Then he fashioned kameya number 2. Kameya number 2 went ahead and cured Yehuda, Dan, and Naphtali. So now kameya number 2 is also a mumcha, because kameya number 2 also cured 3 people. Okay, but the writer, he's still not a mumcha. He cured so far 6 people, but he did it all with the same 2 kameyas. Now he writes kameya number 3. He gives out kameya number 3, and kameya number 3 goes ahead and cures Yisachar, Zvulun, and Yosef. So now, guess what? Kameya number 3 is also a mumcha, because kameya number 3 cured 3 people, and now the writer is a mumcha. Because now the writer has finally reached the point where he cured 3 different people using 3 different kameyas, all with the same lachash, but 3 physical different amulets. Now, it happens to be that in this case, he cured 9 people, but until he cured the last set of 3, he had only cured 6 people using 2 kameyas. That doesn't make you a mumcha writer. In order to be a mumcha writer, you need to cure 3 different people with 3 different kameyas. He cured 6 with 2 kameyas. It's only after the last set, now he cured 9 with 3 kameyas. So now he's a mumcha. Now you have a case where you have 3 kameyas that are all considered mumcha in their own right. Each one of those kameyas is a kameya mumcha, and also the writer is now a kameya mumcha. So congratulations, you've got both milas. And then the Mechaber said, you can make this case a little bit simpler. You don't need 9 people. Or what you could have like this. You could have that the writer could write one kameya, give it to Reuven. Reuven uses it to cure himself from the flu 3 times. So now the kameya is a mumcha. It cured Reuven 3 times. The writer is not a mumcha. He wrote one effective kameya with one person. Then he writes a second one and gives it to Shimon. Shimon uses it to cure himself from the flu 3 times. Congratulations. The second kameya is also kameya mumcha. The writer is still not a mumcha. So far, he's only got 2 people with 2 kameyas. Then he writes a third one, gives it to Levi. It cures Levi 3 times. Oh, now the third kameya is a kameya mumcha, and now the writer is also a mumcha, because now he's cured 3 different people, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, using 3 different kameyas. So now we're 15 minutes into this year, and so far we chazed what we learned yesterday. But now you'll see why it was important. Now the Ramah comes, and the Ramah qualifies what the Mechaber says. The Mechaber just gave us these 2 beautiful cases where the Mechaber says, in these cases, both the writer is considered a writer who's a mumcha, and the individual kameyas are also considered mumcha in their own right. Because in both of these cases, each one of the kameyas has cured 3 times. Either one person 3 times or 3 different people. So each kameya is in its own right a mumcha. Comes along and the Ramah qualifies this. The Ramah says, however, V'dafka shebo ushtei hamcha'os biyachad. This idea that we can have both milas, that the writer is a mumcha and the kameya is a mumcha, really only works if we reach both of those milestones at the same time. Aval, we'll explain what this means. Aval, however, imismachi gavra tchila, if the writer becomes a mumcha before the kameya that he writes is a mumcha, va'achakach osa kameya, and then after he's already a mumcha, he goes ahead and he writes a kameya, v'ripa shalosh pa'amim, and that kameya cures 3 times. Guess what? The kameya does not become a kameya mumcha. Loi talidon ba'abachas ha-kameya. We don't consider that kameya to be a mumcha. Rak b'hamchas ha-gavra shekvar es chazik. We give the credit not to the kameya, but to the writer. So, again, what did the Ramah just say? The Ramah said the Mechaber is going to great length. Now, you might be wondering, why is this even negeya? The Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us why it's negeya la-halacha. It is negeya la-halacha. We'll see in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber went to great lengths to tell me that there are cases where both the writer of the kameya is a mumcha, and the kameya itself is considered a kameya mumcha independent of the writer. Says the Ramah, that does not work in every case. You could have a case where the writer is already established as a mumcha. Now he goes ahead and he writes a kameya, and it turns out to be a very effective kameya. That kameya goes ahead and it cures 3 times. Is that kameya now a mumcha? No. Why? Because since the writer is already a mumcha, when we see that the kameya that he wrote now goes ahead and cures 3 times, it doesn't make the kameya a mumcha independent of the writer, because we give the credit for the effectiveness of that kameya not to the kameya. We give the credit for its effectiveness to the writer. We already have established that this writer is a mumcha. So he wrote a kameya and it worked. It's because he's a mumcha. It's not because the kameya is a mumcha. And therefore, even though this kameya cured 3 times, it does not become a kameya mumcha. Because the writer is the mumcha, not the kameya. Now let's see, go into the weeds. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain what case this is negeya to, and why it's negeya lahalacha. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton tzadik vav. Says the Mishnah Berurah, shtei amchais b'yachad. The Ramah says, you want to have a situation where the writer is considered a mumcha and the kameya is considered a mumcha independent of the writer, you're only going to have that if they both happen at the same time. Now, that's not entirely precise, by the way. We'll see later in the Mishnah Berurah. But right now, that's what the Ramah says. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you what case we're talking about here. Keep going. For example, what's the case where you're going to get both milas? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Keep going. Shekasav Igeris. The writer goes ahead and he writes a text and he fashions a kameah. Veripe l'Ruvain shalosh pa'amim. So he goes ahead, he writes the text, he fashions the kameah, and he gives it to Ruvain. Ruvain uses it 3 times to great effect. Ruvain cures himself from the flu 3 times using this kameah. Okay, so now let's pause here for a second. What do we have at this point? At this point, we have a kameah that's a mumcha, right? This kameah cured 3 times. It cured Ruvain 3 times. So this kameah is a kameah mumcha. Now, if Ruvain wants to take this kameah and he wants to give it to Shimon, who has the flu, Shimon could wear it outside of Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. Why? Because it is a kameah mumcha. Is the writer a mumcha? No, the writer is not a mumcha. So far, he only cured 1 person with 1 kameah. He's not a mumcha. The kameah is a mumcha. Now let's go to step 2. Va'oidi geres l'Shimon shalish pamim. Now the writer goes ahead and he writes a second text, the same lachash, but he writes a new one and he forms a new kameah and he gives it to Shimon, and Shimon uses it to great effect 3 times. Okay, what do we have at this point? Now we're going to call the kameah writer, we're going to call him Yankel the kameah writer. So to this point, Yankel the kameah writer has made 2 kameahs. They both worked 3 times. 1 cured Ruvain 3 times. 1 cured Shimon 3 times. So Yankel the kameah writer now has under his belt 2 kameah mumchim. They're both mumchim, right? But he's still not a mumcha. So far, he cured 2 people 3 times each, using 2 kameahs. He's not a mumcha. But the kameah that Ruvain has is a mumcha. The kameah Shimon has is a mumcha. Okay. Now he continues in his career path. Va'oidi geres, now Yaakov the kameah writer, writes a 3rd kameah using the same lachash. And he makes a 3rd kameah. Veripe l'Shimon oid shtei pamim. Now Shimon lost it. So he gives a new one to Shimon. And it cures Shimon 2 times. Okay. What do we have at this point? At this point, Yankel the kameah writer has made 1 kameah for Ruvain that worked 3 times. It's a kameah mumcha. He made another kameah for Shimon that cured 3 times. It's a kameah mumcha. He's still not a mumcha writer. Now he made a 3rd kameah. He gave it to Shimon. It cured 2 times. Says the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets, Adayin lo yismachi gavra. Yankel the kameah writer is still not a mumcha. Levi shaloi ripei shloisha anoshim. Has he cured 3 people with 3 kameahs? No. He cured only 2 people so far. He cured Ruvain 3 times. He cured Shimon 5 times. But he's only cured 2 people. Now, the 2 people that he cured them with 3 kameahs. Because Ruvain used 1, Shimon used 2. He used his first one the first 3 times, then he lost it, he used the second one 2 times. So he's got, Yankel the kameah writer has got 3 effective kameahs out there, right? He's got 3 effective kameahs out there, but so far, he only cured 2 people, Ruvain and Shimon. V'gam lo yismachi kameah. The 3rd kameah is also not a mumcha yet. The first kameah cured Ruvain 3 times. The first kameah is a mumcha. The 2nd kameah cured Shimon 3 times. The 2nd kameah is a mumcha. The 3rd kameah only cured Shimon twice. So the 3rd kameah is not a mumcha yet, and Yankel the kameah writer is not a mumcha yet, because so far he only cured 2 people. So he's not a mumcha yet. Oh. Va'achakach ripa ba'oisa igeres hashlishes gam leLevi. Now Shimon took the 3rd kameah and he gave it to Levi, who's suffering from the flu. And Levi uses it and it works. What happens now? Well, now the third Kameya has just cured for the third time. It cured Shimon twice, and it cured Levi once. So now the third Kameya becomes a Kameya Mumcha. And also Yankel, the Kameya writer, now becomes a Mumcha. Because now Yankel, the Kameya writer, has successfully cured 3 people, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, using 3 different Kameyas. So you know what happened now? We hit both milestones at the same time. The third Kameya became a Kameya Mumcha, and Yankel, the Kameya writer, became a Mumcha Kameya writer at the same time. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'nimtza shabo shtei amchos b'yachad." In this case, the third Kameya became a Kameya Mumcha at the same time that Yankel, the Kameya writer, became a Mumcha Kameya writer. In that case, you now have a Kameya that's a Kameya Mumcha and a writer who's a Mumcha Kameya writer. Now, let's contrast that to the case where the Ramah says it doesn't work. But if the Kameya writer becomes a Mumcha before the Kameya becomes a Mumcha, then the Kameya never becomes a Mumcha. Why? Because we give the credit to the writer, not to the Kameya. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Loi talinon. We're not going to hinge the effectiveness of the Kameya on the Kameya. We're going to hinge it on the Kameya writer, says the Mishnah Berurah. First of all, what's the halakhic nafkamina? The halakhic nafkamina is Shem Hifse. Okay, I have to first contrast the case over here. The Ramah said, what's the case where you can't get both milas? In the words of the Ramah said, what if the Kameya writer becomes a Mumcha? Then it's a very easy case. The Kameya writer writes one Kameya, he gives it to Reuven, it works. Shimon comes to him, I need a Kameya for the flu. He writes a second Kameya, he gives it to Shimon, it works. Levi comes to him and says, I need a Kameya for the flu. He writes a third Kameya, he gives it to Levi, and it works. Boom, presto, here you have it. The Kameya writer is a Mumcha. He wrote 3 different Kameyas, all of them with the same text. He gave one to Reuven, one to Shimon, one to Levi. He cured all 3 of them. So he cured 3 different people using 3 different Kameyas. He is now a Mumcha. Okay, now let's play it out. Now Yehuda comes to him and says, I need a Kameya for the flu. So he goes ahead, he writes a Kameya, gives it to Yehuda for the flu. Yehuda takes that Kameya and uses it to cure himself from the flu 3 times. So now Yehuda will walk away and he'll say, wow, if I want to sell this Kameya on eBay, you know what I could advertise? I could advertise, I have a Kameya was hot alamilis. I have a Kameya that has all the milas in the world. It was written by a Mumcha Kameya writer, right? Because Yankel, the Kameya writer, before he wrote Yehuda's Kameya, he wrote one for Reuven, one for Shimon, one for Levi, and they all worked. So Yankel, the Kameya writer, is now a Mumcha Kameya writer, and Yehuda says, my Kameya that I want to sell on eBay, it cured me from the flu 3 times. So l'chayr, the Kameya is also a Kameya Mumcha in its own right, because it worked 3 times. Says the Ramah, no, not true. Why? Because you can't say that this Kameya is a Kameya Mumcha. What are you basing on that it's a Kameya Mumcha? Because it cured 3 times? No, its effectiveness is not intrinsic to it. It is not a Kameya Mumcha. Its power is that it was written by an already established Mumcha Kameya writer. It's Yankel's koyach that made this Kameya work. It's not the Kameya's koyach. If the Kameya becomes a Mumcha before the writer, also a very simple case. Yankel, the Kameya writer, writes one Kameya for the flu. He gives it to Yehuda. Yehuda uses it 3 times to great success. Okay, now the Kameya is a Mumcha, but Yankel, the Kameya writer, is not. So in that case, we'll say that the Kameya has intrinsic value as a Kameya Mumcha. We're going to give the credit to the Koyach of the Kameya. We can't give the Koyach to Yankel. Yankel's not established as a Mumcha yet. He only cured one person, albeit 3 times, but he only cured one person with one Kameya. So he is not a Kameya Mumcha. So it must be that the credit goes to the Kameya. So the Kameya is a Kameya Mumcha. But if by the time Yankel the Kameya writer gave a Kameya to Yehuda, he was already established as a Mumcha Kameya writer for the creation of this type of Kameya, for this type of affliction, then there's no mile in the fact that it worked 3 times, that now it becomes a Kameya Mumcha. No, it works because it was written by Yankel, the established Mumcha Kameya writer. That's what the Ramah is saying. Now the question is, who cares? What's a Negeya? What is it Negeya to be able to have both milas? Why is that important? So the Mishnah Berurah says, no, it's very important. It's Negeya lahalacha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why it's Negeya lahalacha. Ois cut tzadik zayin. V'nafkamina. What's the nafkamina? She'im hifsid haroifei hamcha asai. Oh. Yankel the Kameya writer can lose his status of being a mumcha. See, we didn't discuss that yet. We discussed how a Kameya writer becomes a mumcha. But a Kameya writer could become a mumcha. A Kameya writer could also lose his status as a mumcha. How do you lose your status as a mumcha? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kigon, Shekasav oid shalosh igarois v'loi ha'ilu. Let's say Yankel the Kameya writer writes a Kameya for Ruvain and it works. He writes a Kameya for Shimon. It works. He writes a Kameya for Levi. It works. Okay. He's been established as a Mumcha Kameya writer to write Kameyas using this particular text that cures the flu. Okay. Now Yehuda comes to him. He needs a Kameya. He gives a Kameya to Yehuda. Kameya number 4. Using the same text. Guess what? It doesn't work. Then he writes one for Dun. Doesn't work. He writes one for Naphtali. It doesn't work. His win-loss percentage is now 50. He's got 50 wins, he's got 50% wins, 50% losses. He's got 3 wins, 3 losses. Right? So guess what? He should have stopped while he was ahead of the game. When he wrote Ruvain's and he wrote Shimon's and he wrote Levi's, he became a mumcha. But now when he wrote Yehuda's, it didn't work. Nope. He's still a mumcha. We're going to consider it an aberration. Why? We're going to say that it's Yehuda's mazel. Yehuda Epis has Shlechter Mazel, and for Yehuda it didn't work. He writes another one for Don, it also doesn't work. No, apparently Don also has Shlechter Mazel. It didn't work for Don either, but we're going to put the blame on Don, not on Yankel. But now he writes one for Naphtali, and it also doesn't work. Looks like he lost the touch. Yankel lost the touch. Now he loses his status as a mumcha. Now, if he goes and he writes one for Yisachar is not going to be allowed to go out with it on Shabbos. Because Yankel the Kameya writer is no longer a mumcha. So a Kameya writer could lose his status as a Kameya writer, as a mumcha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's why it's Negeya to know if you have both milas. Let's see it inside. V'nafkamina. She'im hifsid haroifei hamcha asai. If the writer loses his status as a mumcha, Kegoin, for example, Shekasav oid shalish igaros v'loi ha'ilu. He writes 3 new kameyas and they don't work. Oz gama kameya shenasan mikfar sheripa shalish pa'amim asura. Da'adayin loy nismacha. Ma she'en ken kishabo shneim b'yachad. If the writer, again, let's give you the case that I gave you before, where the Ramah said that the Kameya does not become invested with the status of being a Kameya Mumcha. Yankel the Kameya wrote an effective Kameya for Ruvain, he wrote an effective one for Shimon, he wrote an effective one for Levi. Now he writes a 4th one, and he gives it to Yehuda, and it proves to be effective. And Yehuda uses it 3 times to great effect. You would have thought, without the Ramah, that Yehuda's Kameya has the mila of both being written by a Mumcha Kameya writer and being a Kameya Mumcha in its own right, because it worked 3 times. Says the Ramah, no. Yehuda's Kameya, the only Maila it has is that it was written by Yankel, the Mumcha Kameya writer. But now what happens if Yankel loses his status as being a Mumcha Kameya writer? It never got, Yehuda's fourth Kameya never got the status of a Kameya Mumcha in its own right. So therefore, when Yankel loses his status as a Mumcha Kameya writer, Yehuda's Kameya is now worthless. It doesn't have the status of being written by a Mumcha Kameya writer, and it never got the Maila of being a Kameya Mumcha, because we were toilet its effectiveness on Yankel the Kameya writer. We weren't toilet its effectiveness on it itself. And therefore, when Yankel the Kameya writer goes out of business, because he's no longer a Mumcha, Yehuda would not be allowed to use this Kameya for a fourth time and go out to Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos with it, because it's no longer a Kameya Mumcha. It never was invested with the status of being a Kameya Mumcha on its own, and the writer lost his status as being a writer of a Kameya Mumcha. Now, let's contrast that to another case. Let's use the case that the Mishnah Berurah gave us originally, where the Mishnah Berurah said, what happens if he gave a Kameya to Reuven, and Reuven used it 3 times to great effect? In that case, that Kameya, Reuven's Kameya, became a Kameya Mumcha before Yankel was a Mumcha Kameya writer. This is the first Kameya Reuven ever wrote. He wrote his first Kameya, he gave it to Reuven, it cured Reuven 3 times. That Kameya is a Kameya Mumcha. Even if a year from now, Yankel the Kameya writer ceases to be a Kameya Mumcha because he blew it 3 times, Reuven's Kameya will still be a Kameya Mumcha, because Reuven's Kameya became invested with the status of Kameya Mumcha before Yankel the Kameya writer ever got the status of being a Mumcha Kameya writer. So even when Yankel loses his status, the original Kameya doesn't lose its status. It got the status of being a Kameya Mumcha before Yankel became a Mumcha Kameya writer. But in the Ramah's case, that's not what happened. In the Ramah's case, it was the flip. Yankel the Kameya writer became a Mumcha Kameya writer before Yehuda's Kameya ever became a Kameya Mumcha. And Yehuda's Kameya won't become a Kameya Mumcha, because no matter how many times it cures, we're going to give the credit to Yankel, we're not going to give the credit to the Kameya. And this is, I got to tell you, this is one of these cases where this is so complex that, we're dealing with these layers of complexity over here, and most people are listening. It doesn't seem very negaya because we don't use Kameyas. Aber Torahi ulalamda anu tzrichim. It's Torah Kedosha. We have to learn it. You should never say that something is not negaya. Maybe the skill of Kameya writing will be brought back, and then we'll know what the halach is. Okay. So, and there's very important words here in the Mishnah Berurah, in Oiskat and Tzadik Zayin. Masha'enke kishabo shnein biyachad. So this is why the Ramah says, if the Kameya is elevated to the status of a Kameya Mumcha at the same time that the Kameya writer becomes a Mumcha, then it is invested with the status of being a Kameya Mumcha. Or if the Kameya became a Kameya Mumcha before the writer became a Mumcha Kameya writer. In either one of those cases, the Kameya will be invested with its own intrinsic status of being a Kameya Mumcha. So just to risk being too repetitive over here, especially 38 minutes into the year, if the Kameya becomes invested with the status of Kameya Mumcha before the writer, so that was the simple case, Yankel the Kameya writer wrote his first Kameya, he gave it to Reuven, it cured Reuven 3 times. Or he gave it to Reuven, it cured Reuven. Reuven gave it to Shimon, it cured Shimon. Shimon gave it to Levi, it cured Levi. Either way, Reuven wrote 1 Kameya, and that Kameya cured 3 times. That Kameya is now invested with Kameya Mumcha status, even though the writer is not. So now I don't care what happens to the writer. That Kameya will always retain its status of being a Kameya Mumcha. Or the other case is that the Kameya got invested with the status of Kameya Mumcha at the same time that the writer did. That was the more complex case of Mishnah Berurah and Tzadik Vav. And that was the case where Yaakov the Kameh wrote one Kameh, gave it to Ruvain, and cured Ruvain 3 times. So now that's a Kameh Mumcha, even though the writer is not. He wrote a second Kameh, he gave it to Shimon. Shimon used it 3 times. So now that second Kameh is a Kameh Mumcha, even though the writer is not. Those 2 Kamehs will always retain their status of Kameh Mumcha. I don't care what happens to Yankel. But the third Kameh that he gives to Shimon, because Shimon lost his first one, and he cures Shimon twice, right? And then he goes ahead and he gives it to Levi, and he cures Levi. So that's the case where they both happen at the same time. When Levi uses it and it cures Levi, now at the same time, that third Kameh becomes a Kameh Mumcha, because it cured Shimon twice and Levi once, so it cured 3 times. And Yaakov the Kameh writer becomes a writer who's a Mumcha, because now he cured 3 people, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, with 3 different Kamehs. In that case also, the Kameh will always retain its status of being a Kameh Mumcha, because it happened at the same time that the writer became a Mumcha. But if the writer becomes a Mumcha first, and then he writes a Kameh, and the Kameh cures 3 times, that Kameh will never receive the status of being a Kameh Mumcha in its own right, because all of its success will be pinned to Yankel the Kameh writer. Yankel goes out of business, the Kameh is no longer considered to be a Kameh Mumcha. Oh boy. Okay. Let's finish up over here. So now, second line from the bottom, in the Mechaber, middle of the line, Aval. Avalim kasav shloisha kameim la'adam echad v'ripoi shalosh pa'amim. But now, let's say Yaakov the Kameh writer writes 3 kameim for 1 person. So, Reuven comes to him, I need a kameh for the flu. He writes him a kameh, he gives it to him, he uses it, and it works. Next year, he comes to him, remember last year you gave me a kameh for the flu? I have the flu again. Don't you have the command I gave you last year? I lost it. He writes him another one. He gives it to him. He uses it. It works. The next year he comes to him. Remember the last 2 years? You gave me the command for the flu and they worked. I should have held on to them. I lost it again. I have the flu again. Can you write me another command? He writes him another command. So now Reuven wrote 3 commands. They were all effective, but they all cured the same people. So is the writer a mumcha command? No. He cured 1 person 3 times with 3 different kameas. That doesn't make you a mumcha writer. To be a mumcha writer, you need to cure 3 different people with 3 kameas, not 1 person 3 times with 3 kameas. So you're not a mumcha writer. If Yankel did that, he's not a mumcha writer. How about the kameas? Well, each kamea only cured 1 time. So says the Mechaber, Aval Mekasav Shloisha Kameim La'adam Echad V'Ripay Shalosh Pamim Lo Yismachei Lo Gavra. The Gavra, the person, is not a Mumcha Kameh writer. V'Lo Kameh. And the Kameh is not a certified Kameh. It's not a Kameh Mumcha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cut inside the test, Lo Gavra. The person is not a Mumcha writer. He can't go create another Kameh now, give it to somebody and allow that person to go out to Rishos HaRabim. Because since the 3 Kamehs that he wrote only cured 1 person, the reason why, you see, people might have this kasha. I don't understand. Why isn't he a Mumcha writer? The bottom line is he wrote 3 kamehs, and they each worked. They cured, right? He cured 3 times with 3 kamehs. In other words, what's the difference if Yankel wrote 3 kamehs, and 1 cured Reuven, 1 cured Shimon, and 1 cured Levi, or he wrote 3 kamehs, and they cured Reuven 3 times? Why does the first case make him a mumcha and the second case not? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. I'll tell you why the second case doesn't make him a mumcha. Because we're not going to give the credit to Yankel. We're going to give the credit to Reuven. We're going to say Reuven has a mazel that kameas work for him. But who says if he writes a kameh for Shimon it'll work? Maybe it won't work for Shimon. So this doesn't make him a mumcha. The concept of Magen Avram writes, very interesting. The Magen Avram says, if Yankel, the Kameh writer, would write the Kameh for Reuven, and Reuven would use it and it cures him, and next year he gives him a new kameah and it cures him, and the next year he gives him a new kameah and it cures him, and the fourth year he gives him a new kameah, so fine. You're telling me if we give it to Shimon can't go out with it. Why? Because maybe it's Reuven's mazel. Okay, but how about Reuven? Could Reuven go out with it? I mean, l'chayra, this kameah, Yaakov the kameah writer, wrote this kameah for me already 3 times. It worked each time. Now, you want to tell me it's my mazel? Fine, it's my mazel. But now he wrote me a 4th one. Could I go out with it? Says the Magen Avraham. No, it's not called kameah mumcha. You can't go out with it. Ois cut kof like kameah. The kameah is also not a mumcha. The kameah lo yismarche. Rakishi gersakas ripashalish pamim. In order for a kameah to be a mumcha, it has to cure 3 times. All right, it's 45 minutes, and we just finished Pei Aleph Amud Beis. I'm not going to go now on to Pei Beis Amud Aleph. I'm going to have to stick in an extra shear. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm going to have to stick in an extra shear, and one day will have to be 2 shiurim, but I am not going to sacrifice clarity in the name of the pace. I try very hard to stick to the pace. I think in 160 plus shiurim, I think this might be really the first time that this has happened, but I am not going to sacrifice clarity for the sake of the pace. We will catch up, Emir Hashem. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. So limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua Sefurus Parnas and Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Biaskal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.